So Meredith, thank you for joining us here on the Retire Sooner podcast. And I want to get into, in my the last book that I just published, What the Happiest Retirees Know, we have a chapter on really on love, relationships, and when we're thinking about retiring, we're thinking about a happy retirement. A huge part of it is the relationship we have with our partner, our spouse, and in reading about and seeing you, or in reading your work. I don't know where I read this, but the thought around divorce rates that have been declining in general, but age 50 plus divorce rates doubling, or divorce rates doubling since the early 90s, and then 65 plus have tripled. What is going on with? Is that all true? Is that like just an opinion? Or are those pretty reliable statistics? Like that's really what's happening?
Yeah, I'm going to be an annoying therapist and tell you it depends. But, statistics are always one of those things that's changing. And, is it being underreported, overreported, and where are you getting the samples? So, but I would say generally from everything I've seen, that is roughly the case. Yes, there is this huge rise in divorce rate among people who are empty nesters. So that would account for, again, over 50, over 65. So there's a lot of reasons why this happens. And some of these are parallel to the reasons why divorce rates in general have been on the rise since, the 1950s and 1900s. And a lot of it has to do now, I think, with this rise because we have a longer life expectancy. And it used to be that, when you got married, it was marriage for life. And if you happen to like this person, great. But you weren't expected to because...
like them.
If you have, it was great, like sugar on top. But, if you think back in very kind of early civilizations, right, marriage was an economic arrangement. It was not a love match. And so then with the Industrial Revolution, we started moving to having a love match. So our priorities around finding this partner changed, right? So back in the days of old, one, you had women who were not in the workforce, so they financially and economically had no ability to leave if they wanted to, plus intense social stigma if they did. Yeah. And then, as we've kind of moved past that, women have more economic flexibility now, but also too, we want such different things from marriage than what we did, several hundred years ago, right?
Okay, so I don't know if, Meredith, I don't know if I've ever really thought of it that way, but it makes total sense, is that 200 years ago, now, again, there are plenty of movies that go back hundreds of years and they're love stories, but you're saying that most of the time, a union or a marriage really was very much just an economic thing. That's kind of the way marriage has that was early marriage days, is what you're saying?
Right. Yes. So basically, history of humans up to around the industrial revolution, that was the case. It was an economic arrangement usually made by the parents, and maybe you know this person before, maybe you don't. So it was kind of a toss-up about, is this going to be terrible? And if so, I'm just going to hope that my partner dies before I do, and hopefully quickly, or am I just going to be in misery for forever? But this was also a time too when the role of religion plays into that too. So it's like, okay, the afterlife is supposed to be where you're happy. So the purpose of marriage was not to make you happy. And now, again, post-industrial revolution, that's our goal, right? The idea of being someone for 50, 60 years and being miserable sounds terrible, right? None of us want to do that. That sounds awful. And so that's part of this, is now too, with increased life expectancies, when you have two people who they've gone through the business of child rearing, all those things, and then they come to this point and say, well, wait a sec, kids are gone, but now I still have another 30, 40, 50 years left to live. I don't want to deal with you. And because we have the economic flexibility now, it's a lot easier to envision a life without that person and not wanting to spend, again, the next several decades with someone that maybe you're not so fond of.
But the catalyst, so again, we've kind of gone through these different generations. In today's, let's call it baby boomer, and I know that this terminology, maybe to explain this gray divorce scenario, and then what are the big catalysts? Is it beyond just, hey, the kids are out of the house? What are some of the other catalysts for this group and the rise in divorce rates?
Right, yeah. So I would say the biggest overarching catalyst, and this is true for any relationship, is how we allowed ourselves to become disconnected, and that happens in such subtle ways. It's not like you didn't text your wife back once and then that's it, right? If you think about, though, all these tiny little moments, and if we don't address them, if we don't find a way to repair and reconnect, it's almost like every little interaction becomes a grain of sand, right? One little grain of sand, not a big deal. But then when you have a multitude of these over decades, then you've got a beach. So then you've got a big problem. So what I think happens for every couple that ends up saying, we quote unquote fell out of love, it's because we had so many of those little moments of disconnection that it didn't seem tenable, right? And that we do emotionally close ourselves off at some point. There is kind of a point of no return, right? Where we're no longer interested in trying to repair. So the sooner you repair, the better.
The easier. The sooner you try to fix,
Yes.
the better, right?
Right, exactly.
And again, I guess, Meredith, this goes for, any age, really. This disconnect. I love this analogy. Well, it's a dark analogy, but the thought of
therapist life.
Yeah, grain of sand, and it's no big deal if it's a few, but eventually it's a dump truck worth of sand, and all of a sudden you can't get out from under it, and it's almost too late to go to therapy. But let me just go back, and then my wonder too, how much of it is societal, but that's kind of a broad term that kind of goes into economic independence, social media. You mentioned just general disconnectedness, and is that just a societal? Is there something to do with our society today that makes us a little bit more disconnected? If you think about, I'm fascinated by Facebook's change to Meta, right? Like they're betting their entire future on a parallel universe that is just made up, right? The metaverse is just a big video game that you can live in. And when I think about that, it's almost, to me, it's like a sad thing. Like, I guess for some people that might be great and it may be a really nice outlet, but for humanity in general, to me, it's actually really sad that one of the largest companies on the planet is betting the future of the company on living in a fake world, a fake society, virtual society, right? That's the metaverse, isn't it?
Yeah, that's
so is societally,
I actually didn't know about that. That's terrifying.
Yeah, think about it. So if you look at Facebook, and I'm not saying to sell the stock or buy the stock to our listeners, but if you go look at Facebook, the symbol is still FB as in Facebook, but the name is now changed. It's Meta. They have changed their name to Meta because their future is the metaverse. Like, put on the Oculus glasses and live in a fake world, right? So again, it means you're probably going to have more couples that you need to help. But let's go back to what you do. So you've got a couple, they've got maybe not a dump truck of sand with your analogy, but it's starting to really build. When do people, when is it the point of no return? How often are you able to help people when they come to you? Couple, right. They've been together for 7 years, 10 years, 15, I don't know what the number is. And what do you typically see when you've got this disconnect? What is the problem usually?
So the overarching thing is more about perspective. If I'm looking at, again, this dump truck of sand and it looks huge and I already feel buried in it, I'm not going to be that committed to wanting to dig out of it. If you look from your perspective and it looks like a little like gallon bucket of sand, that's not so bad, right? So it's perspective, and it's about each person's willingness to try, right? To work on this, because a lot of times there will be a mismatch in terms of people's commitment to the relationship a little bit, but overall you both have to be very, very committed to saving it. It cannot fall on one person. And I find that couples do much better and have much better outcomes in therapy if they come in sooner. So before we're both, if we're both under this dump truck of sand, most of the time that's when they're just kind of checking the box to say, all right, we tried this before we got a divorce, but they weren't really actually interested in trying, right? That's kind of the point of no return.
You can tell, right?
Oh,
if a couple comes in and they're checking the box, as an example, you can kind of tell pretty quickly.
Usually, yeah. So one of the biggest things that I see of the couples who are kind of, again, on the we've put too much sand in the back of this truck are the couples who have no interest in listening to each other. And I will, try to jump in and try to reframe and slow down. But if they really have no interest in hearing what the other person says, learning about the other person's perspective, and trying something new, not to sound like a total downer, but that's a situation where I don't have so much hope for them. But here's the interesting thing, because, as we talk about disconnection, I think it's important to think about the role of happiness and the priority of happiness in marriages, because this is a cultural thing and it does have a big impact. So divorce rates in the US compared to most of the world actually are significantly higher. And that's because we live in this individualistic culture where we choose our love match, right? And so our priority is to be happy. And so then there's all of this pressure and this, if I'm not happy, something's wrong. If I'm not happy, I chose wrong. Versus in other cultures where if there's an arranged marriage, your first priority probably isn't to be in love and happy with this person. And so maybe you put up with more because, again, you're not looking for them to fill that role. And in those countries, the stigma is usually around saying you can't pursue your individual happiness over the stability and the well-being of the family. But again, it's not like there's ever a right or wrong. It's just very, very different lenses.
So if we go to another culture, what about? Let's go back to those other. I don't know what that culture would be. Maybe it's India, Asia. I don't know. Let's say something very different than the United States. Is there what about just the natural inclination of humans to actually be with the right fit, though? Does that just kind of culturally go away, or is that always there bubbling up under the surface? If you go to one of these other cultures, like what happens to that natural thought of like the love of your life kind of thing, right? The natural wanting to be happy. Does that really go away?
No, because we're a social bonding species and we get a whole lot of oxytocin from having deep connection with someone, having a deep affection for them. And the thing is, it's more of thinking about the role of, your spouse. They're not seeing their spouse as maybe needing to, again, supply that romantic love. And it's interesting because like affairs, I think, happen just universally, but that's a culture where it's a little more accepted, not in terms of it should happen, but if it happens, getting a divorce is worse than breaking up the family. So it's, if you don't romantically love this person, find another outlet, find some other way to fulfill yourself, but you don't get to break up the family just because you want something different, which is, again, almost entirely different than this country.
Yeah, I was saying that's totally unacceptable here in the United States, right? It's not, that is not the cultural norm, right? You're on
no, you're shamed for staying.
Right. You're on like page 6, right? If the minute something like that happens, but if you go to, would you say in Europe or in India, where is that more acceptable?
I would say, honestly, if you compared worldwide, the U.S. stands out most in terms of having that individualistic, which again is kind of part of our culture, right? We're the country of, pursuit of happiness, right? And dream as big as you can, which is great, but there's a downside to it. Everything's double-edged. So most other places in the world, they do have more of this collectivist, the stability of the family is the first priority. So Europe, yes, I would say Europe is like a slight step down. So if, we went USA is highest and then, Europe and then some of the other places, but I would say Africa, the Middle East, South America, those places are certainly places where getting a divorce would be far more stigmatized, no matter the age.
Wow. No kidding. I would never have really known that. I have heard of that, like, in Italy, it's more acceptable to have this romantic. But hearing it from you as a marriage therapist is it kind of amazing. I guess it does make sense, but it's hard to conceive. What would you say too if you're thinking of, let's say, older, gray divorce, or you're getting divorced older, later in life, and maybe this is really questions for at any point, but I know you kind of have three questions that you need to be asking yourself to see if this is something that you really would be considering. Because let me do, before you answer that, before we started recording, you had been saying something around how just difficult. Let's just remind people how brutal divorce is.
Oh, so brutal. It's one of the worst crises you can go through in your life, no matter the point that you're at. And I'm sure we'll get to this more later, but I think one of the biggest things that sets gray divorce apart is that people forget how to be as conscious and as mindful and as thoughtful about it as they usually do when they're getting divorced earlier on. So if you've got young children running around your house, you can't ignore that, right? You have to think about their well-being. When the children are out of the house, it's kind of easier to say out of sight, out of mind.
What you're saying is that, let's say you're in your 30s and you got little kids, that the two parents getting divorced might behave, you're saying, more civilized because the kids are there. What you're saying, when your 65 kids are totally out of the picture, you're saying those are maybe even less civilized.
So it's an interesting thing. It's, who are we being civil to? Is it to your partner? It depends. But I would say that, civility towards your children and their reactions is a lot more flexible and compassionate when the kids are young versus, again, when you're older. Because I heard this quote someone say, and I was like, it's exactly what it is. We forget that adult children can have hurt feelings too. They're not right under our feet. So we're not thinking about how every decision we make is going to affect them, right? And again, it's not because we don't love them, but our job as parents is mostly done. They're emotionally responsible for taking care of themselves. And so we forget that if we're making a big change like this, it is going to affect them. It's so fascinating. So parents are always so worried when they have young kids. Is it the right time? Is it the right time? There is no right or wrong time. But I rarely have a child in my office because the parents are going through a divorce. I get adult children in my office who are saying, it's been 6 years and I'm still so distraught and I don't know how to be and I don't know how to accept this and my parents tell me to get over it and I just, I'm trapped, right? That's what I see more. And so this is where this becomes a point of interest for me.
So I'm the product of. Did you have? Did your parents get to go through a divorce? What happened with you growing up?
Yeah.
By the way?
Oh,
how did you end up becoming a marriage and family therapist?
Let's see. Is this like a weekend retreat? How long do we have? We'll be here for a minute. I'm kidding. So my parents divorced when I was 16. And at the time, it was quite frankly pretty traumatic because I didn't know there were problems. They were very good at making sure to keep everything under wraps. And so it felt like my world got turned upside down. And then on top of that, and not bashing my parents because we've done so much repair and I love them both so dearly. They really put me in this parentified role. So my little sister was actually around how old you were. She was 12. So we all protected her. And then I got put in this kind of mediating role. And so I was hearing from both of my parents and all the mudslinging and everything else. And so I decided, well, maybe I'll get paid to, mediate family dynamics in the future.
So at 16, that's a word I don't know if I've heard before, but you were parentified?
Parentified. So parentified just is a fancy. Yeah. See, it's a silly word.
You were parentified and as a teenager.
Yeah, parentified is just a very silly, fancy word for saying that a kid who is really too young to be given parental roles, responsibilities, information was put in that position, right? So at 16, I shouldn't have known about my parents' divorce settlement. The ins and outs, like, who was getting what from retirement, that kind of thing. That was not something that at 16 I needed to know. So that's kind of what parentified looks like. Does that clarify that?
It's exactly, I never heard that before, and that's exactly what happened to me. So starting at about 12, I started hearing about it, and from mostly one side, and heard a lot about it. I remember pretty vividly hearing about this and knowing that this was coming. And then knowing that the divorce would happen, and then it did, and then it went back and forth for a couple of years. But then the older I got, into 13, 14, 15, then I got even more from my parents about either side. So I heard a lot about that. And I never, I don't know, I almost give it a little bit of credit of helping me maybe grow up a little bit quicker. So I always looked at it as almost it wasn't necessarily a bad thing to go through, at least the way I saw it. Maybe I think it was harder on my little siblings. So at the same time, I ended up with my little siblings were 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 when I'm the oldest of 4, and we have a pretty big gap. But anyway, so you kind of went through this, and then you decided to do this and pursue this as a career.
Right. Yeah. I might as well, if I'm going to do it and I've been used to doing it for so long, I might as well, get paid for it, right? Ideally.
Before we get to 3 questions, I wanted to kind of remind people that just how tough divorce can be, right? I mean, in the last decade or so, or the last 5 years, I've had a lot of really close friends go through a divorce. I've had a sibling go through divorce. My mom go through a divorce, so another divorce. So I've seen all this firsthand, and it is really rough, and there's a really long period of time. It doesn't have to be. I always hear that it's at least a year or 2 of terrible life. It doesn't necessarily seem to be. Not everybody goes through this horrible time for years, but it kind of a range, right? From it could be anywhere. It's a really tough year. If kind of what you've said is it is pretty brutal.
Right. So everything about the divorce, whether it's your adjustment financially, emotionally, whatever, your children's adjustment, and every other piece in this comes down to what is your relationship like with the person that you're going through the divorce with like? What are your power differentials? What's that dynamic? Can you be kind of amicable? Is it pretty acrimonious? Is it contentious? Is it amicable? And, are you able to both hold space and respect them as a partner? I think everything else that comes from that, that's kind of the drop that starts the bigger ripples. And then everyone is so different about how they process things. It's kind of the same reason why 2 people could go through the same incident and one person has PTSD and the other person doesn't. It's because we're all just wired so differently. So the point is not to try to make these like grand generalizations of what you should do when you shouldn't do. I think the most important thing anyone can do going through a divorce, no matter what age your children are, is think about the emotional needs of your kids and talk to them about it.
But with young or older.
Yes, exactly.
Young or adult children, because you made the point earlier that it's really can be very tough for a 25-year-old who's grown up with their parents and, they're grown up, they're fine. Mm-hmm. But wait a minute, mom or dad divorced, that can be really tough is what you're saying.
Traumatic even. So there's something that we usually refer to when we're talking about like affairs of people doing this revisionist history where something happens, a trauma happens, and they go back in their memory reel and they say, wait a sec, were all of my memories a lie? Was all of this made up? Like, am I wrong? And it's really, really difficult. And the same thing, if you were a child of a family where, again, you had the same home the entire time growing up, mom and dad seemed really happy. Mom and dad suddenly saying, oh yeah, no, we haven't loved each other for years and it's been awful. That's going to hit that adult child probably pretty traumatically, because it's going to make them question everything about those memories of the childhood.
That's why it can be so traumatic. It's like
exactly.
I was growing up in a lie.
Yes, exactly.
That's the problem. Oh, I was growing up in a lie. Okay.
Yeah. And when we have little kids, when people are thinking about getting a divorce and they've got younger kids, they are so conscious of how do I limit the impact on my kids, right? They are very, very protective of their kids, which is wonderful. And they certainly should do that. I think what happens is when you get older, you forget that, again, your kids still have the same emotions and they still need you to be a parent in that way. And so we kind of abandon our parental roles of needing to, care for our children and make space for their needs and hear them.
But if you end up going through one of these, let's call it a gray divorce, I think the message here, what you're saying, Meredith, is that you've got to think about the kids just as much as you would have if they were 10, even though they might be 30, because
exactly.
it can really be traumatic. Very interesting. One of the things too, and again, when I do this happy versus unhappy retiree research, because I know, and I think I remember doing this particular research around the same time I had 1 or 2 close people in my life going through divorce. And I remember wanting to ask the question around marriage and divorce and how big of an impact is there on happiness. And I thought I thought I would the way it would go is that the more divorces, the more marriages you have, the lower your levels of happiness, because divorce is so brutal. And I remember getting back the data, and there was no material impact on happiness on the second marriage, which made me, again, meaning that people that had gone through a divorce and they're remarried were no less happy at all than people that were still in their first marriage, which surprised me a little bit. I would, now that I've thought about it more, it makes sense. And we've deemed this as everybody gets a marriage mulligan, and it's it's okay. The data even says it's okay. Second, when the data shows that in a third and a fourth marriage, I do see in general happiness levels have declined. And maybe there's some other things happening if you're getting married and divorced multiple times. But this is, again, part of what the happiest retirees know. One of the things we talk about is a marriage mulligan. And from what I can tell, at least in my data or my research, is that people can go through it and they can be just as happy as they ever were, even though they have to go through the trauma, to your point, of divorce.
Exactly. I think that's actually a really excellent point of, if you really are this unhappy with the person you're with, it's okay to divorce. I think people sometimes, blow up the impact of divorces like it is the worst thing in the world, so I can never do this. And they sacrifice their own happiness. I mean, one of the biggest indicators of childhood adjustment is not, if the parents are married or not. It's actually maternal depression. So if you have a terrible relationship with the person you're married to and you're staying together for the kids, you might actually be doing more harm. So divorce in and of itself is not a bad thing. It's just how you approach it.
Let's go into what do we need to, what do our audience, what should people ask themselves when they're really thinking about going through a divorce? We kind of said, we've kind of talked about this in a couple ways. One, this is no small thing, right? Getting divorced is a big deal. It's also not the end of the world, right? So sometimes it gets we almost overestimate how horrible it is, trapping people in marriages that maybe they shouldn't be trapped in. But to your point, in a lot of ways, for kids, it's better to have divorced parents than unhappy parents. So we've kind of gone this full gamut here. But let's say you're thinking about this, or our audience is thinking, or they're in a rough spot and there's too much sand in the dump truck to clear out. What are the questions people need to be asking themselves before they really go through this process or think seriously about divorce?
Mm-hmm. I think it's all about not just looking at the here and now, but really zooming out and looking at the bigger picture. Because the longer you've been married, the more your lives are going to be intertwined. And so then the harder it's going to be to separate them. And again, if you've been unhappy with your spouse for years and your child has no idea, they are not going to suddenly say, oh, okay, you were so unhappy and dad was a jerk. Great. And side with you. That's not how this happens. In fact, it's usually the opposite. So you need to be very, very conscious and very intentional. Yeah. I had come up with just a couple questions, and really the questions, the meaning behind that is to be very intentional, very conscious and thorough and thinking about what happens, not just next week, next month, next year, but what happens in my bank account, in my relationships with my children, the relationships with my friends, family, community. If you're getting divorced much older, let's say that, you're in that 65 plus, right? You're around 70. And if you're a male and you're married to a female and you were the breadwinner, right? She was working from home or stay-at-home mom. My understanding is that anything acquired, so if you're the only one putting into that retirement account, that's considered marital assets, right? So then you might have to give up half of that. And are you going to be okay? Will you be able to sustain if you have to give up half of that at 65 or 70? So that's a big part of it. And then also the social capital is huge. We know that older people who are unpartnered and don't have a good social system tend to have worse health outcomes. So if you split up with this person and if it gets very, very contentious, is it worth the risk, or who are you going to lose in the process? And again, with your children, you might envision one outcome, but you have no control over how your children are going to perceive this change.
Yeah. Yeah. So and again, let's say you're in your mid 60s or 70s, you may think your children react one way, and you've seen this, Meredith, and be relatively unpredictable.
Oh, very much
Kids
so.
can take it way harder than parents might think. Adult kids.
Yes, I think that the best way to preserve a good relationship with your children when you're getting a divorce is to preserve how they're going to see the other parent. So not doing the mudslinging, because I think people make the mistake of thinking, well, they'll just see it from my side and then that'll be fine. But you need to go into it assuming that your child is going to continue having a relationship with both people.
With both, yeah.
Yes, exactly. Don't stop trying to undermine your stop trying to undermine your other parent, because, from their perspective, this is their parent. I remember actually at 17, when my parents had kind of gone through the mudslinging, and I remember saying to both of them, I'm like, I love you both equally, and I need you to stop putting me in the middle. And it was, it was kind of a profound thing, and it really did end up creating some changes. But it was because I needed them to know that both of them telling me things I really shouldn't have known about wasn't actually helping me to feel closer, to feel connected or trusting with either of them. Right?
What are your top three? And this is again another generality. Maybe it's distrust or what part of what you were saying earlier. These grains of sand. That what is there an overarching thing that seems to be an epidemic of why we get divorced in America? But maybe beyond just the happiness question, what do you see that shows up all the time? Your typical pattern of divorce. Why are people getting divorced in general? Like the actual reason.
Yeah. It's not unrelated to happiness, but I would say disappointment. Our expectations for what we thought marriage was going to be, what this relationship was going to be, like what child rearing was going to be, how we were going to do financially, how we were communicating. So often when we get to that point of no return, it's because we've been so disappointed for so long that, again, you can't really see out. And so that's why addressing things as they happen and figuring out that balance and making sure to not just let everything go under the rug, pick your battles, but also don't just let things build up. And what I hear so many times is parents saying, well, when the kids come, the kids almost act like this linchpin to keep the parents together, right? There's so much stress that comes with that first child. And for about 70% of people, their marital satisfaction takes a nosedive. For 30% of people, that actually goes up. No one stays the same, because if you have children, I know anyone with children can attest to this. It's not just reshuffling the board. It's throwing the board out and saying, all right, new game. Let's figure it out.
Yeah, totally right.
Yeah, nothing is going to be more trying on a couple than what happens there. And again, a lot of it is just failed expectations and disappointments. And then when we decide, well, I want to stay with this person because of the kid, but our relationship centers around the business of managing the child rearing, we lose
the
connection.
Business of kids. Listen, I got 4 of them, so I know it is it's a whole bit. It's like a franchise business or so. I got so many of them. But what about, how do you fix that, Meredith? When you say disappointment, I don't know if I've ever thought of it that way, but can you fix that? Or do you is it more about, hey, you're on it, to be forthright and honest about, hey, this is where I'm disappointed. Can we fix it?
Yes. Is the simple answer. I'm going to get yes to all of it.
We've solved all marriage.
I know. That's
We've
it.
solved HBO's best show of all time. How do we fix it? We'll end up on that note, because I think, how do we see people? So you answered this question, disappointment, right? That's very much a common theme of people they're disappointed. That could happen in a million different ways, but people get disappointed and they don't fix it. What would be the fix to that? Again, in general, how can we get ourselves undisappointed, as a very clinical term?
Yeah, I would say the best thing to do is, one, address things as they're happening. Don't have like your manifesto of every way this person has disappointed you for the last 18 years and then pull it out the day that the kid leaves and say, well, let me just, no, that doesn't work. You have to address things as they're happening in the moment. And you have to do it in a way that's not blaming, where you're taking ownership and saying, hey, listen, I feel really hurt when this happens. And where you're more saying, can you please care about the fact that this hurts me, rather than get into the you did. That doesn't work. So it's really about, I would say, if we want to kind of wrap this up in a sentence or two, it's about finding a pattern of communication and having such a value on your partnership with the other person that you want to maintain that. And you want to maintain that if it means you making changes, if it means telling them something that's going on, if you need something different. It's really about valuing that partnership and working very hard to preserve it, because I'm sure, as you know, as with a marriage with 4 children, happy, healthy marriages don't just happen. They're something, it takes work every single day, and it's not 50-50, it's 100-100.